For me, there is something mesmerizing when setting up a new watercolor palette with fresh paint. I have to say, it's one of my favorite activities. For me, it's almost like watching the first flower buds of spring emerge with the anticipation that summer is coming. Usually, when I set up a new watercolor palette, I have fresh new colors to play around with, and I'm anxiously excited to explore with these new colors. So, yeah, setting up a watercolor palette for me is just a fun experience. And over the years, I've come up with 3 criteria that I use when choosing a watercolor palette, which I'm actually going to be sharing with you today. So here are 3 criteria that I use when choosing the best watercolor palette for me. Criteria number 1, how many colors can it hold? It seems pretty self-explanatory, but knowing how many paints you're going to store inside of your palette is actually a pretty good starting off place when choosing a watercolor palette. Over the years, I've accumulated a larger selection of colors, and more recently, I wanted to store those colors in a larger palette. For this reason, I chose a palette that could hold 48 colors. So this palette would be a rather large palette compared to some of my smaller palettes, which only hold maybe 12 or 24. Criteria number 2. How am I planning on using it? Now, as discussed earlier, I knew I wanted a palette that held a larger amount of colors, but at the same time, I still wanted something that was relatively easy to travel with. That meant that a porcelain palette, which is actually my favorite type of palette to work on, would really be out of the question since porcelain is just so heavy. So I had to decide between a plastic palette and a metal palette. And I chose metal due to its sturdy structure and, well, to be just quite frank, I hate plastic palettes. I've used them over the years and I never really like them. In my opinion, when you're choosing between a metal and a plastic palette, for me at least, I will lean towards the metal. They're usually about the same price and I just prefer the metal palette. Criteria number 3, how does the paint puddle in it? If you've been working with watercolor for some time, you'll realize how important it is to get your paint to behave correctly inside your palette. This means pooling or puddling is good and beading is bad. Porcelain palettes are actually the best when it comes to getting your paints to pool inside that palette, but plastic palettes and metal palettes are kind of somewhere in the middle where when you first buy them at least, they will bead a lot with your paint, which makes it really difficult when you're trying to mix colors or even gauge how much paint you have actually mixed. Since I chose a metal palette this time as more of my travel palette, I knew I would need to do some prepping to my palette before I actually used it to help prevent this beading from happening. Now, I've tried other means of trying to prevent this beading from happening, but someone actually suggested to me that I use toothpaste to rough up the metal portions of the palette and help aid in that pooling, which I tried here. And I have to say it really worked nicely. So I have to say I'm going to be keeping this little trick handy for the future. And those are my top 3 criteria for choosing a watercolor palette. Now this palette is an inexpensive, it's called F Club metal palette that I purchased on Amazon about 2 weeks ago. So I've been playing around with it for about 2 weeks and I purchased it for less than $20. Another reason why I chose this one compared to other metal palettes that I've seen online is basically because The exterior of it was black, which I actually prefer. And there were a couple of other brands that had them in colors, but they didn't have the black in stock. So I just went with this particular brand. That's not really an important reason for choosing a watercolor palette, but for me it was important. And another thing that I really liked about this palette is that the half pans are actually removable. And for me personally, I like to switch my paints up and mix them around. So this made it easier for me to do so. So yeah, that's about it about how I come up with choosing my own watercolor palette. Let me know in the comments below what type of watercolor palette is your favorite and why. And I'd also love to read your answers about different ways or tips or tricks that you use to help your paint kind of pool in your palette instead of bead up. That would be really helpful for me, and I'm sure other people who are viewing this video. And that's it for this video. Lots of love, y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.